Let me start. So welcome everyone to the webinar for the presentation of the Alignment Cookbook, technical review of methodologies assessing portfolio alignment with low carbon trajectories or temperature goals, which was prepared by Louis Bachelier Institute in collaboration with the Institute for Climate Economics and sponsored by WWF France and by the Ministère de Transition écologique with the support of the European Union. So today's edition is more destined to the academia, but it will not be as different as that from Wednesday edition for the investors. Okay, my name is Peter Tankov. I am a professor of finance at INSAE, Institut Polytechnique de Paris, and scientific director of the Green and Sustainable Finance Program of Louis Bachelier Institute. So let me say a few words about this program. This is a permanent program whose objective is to boost applied academic research in the field of green and sustainable finance. The head of the program is Pierre-Louis Lyons from Collège de France. The day-to-day management is done by Stéphane Voisin and myself, and we work in close collaboration with the data lab of Louis Bachelier Institute. The topics are the typical green and sustainable finance topics like scenario analysis, stress testing, impact measures, modeling of climate risks, and ESG data. Our aim is to build a collaborative platform between academic institutions and the financial industry and facilitate so the collaborations with investors interested in green finance. So we, as part of the activity, we organize conferences. Typically, every year we organize the Green Finance Research Advances Conference with the Banque de France. We write papers and we publish reports. And so today we will present the report on the portfolio alignment prepared in the framework of this program. Let me first present the speaker, the panelists. First, Clément from the Ministry of Ecological Transition will say a few words about the general context of the report. Then Alice from Institute of Climate Economics will place the report in the general context of alignment to the Paris Agreement. Then Julie will present the report. And finally, during that presentation, I will also discuss a few open questions and uncertainty issues which are more relevant to the academic community. Now, please feel free during the presentations to type your questions in the chat box, and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. Now, please, Clément, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. So my name is Clément Bultel. I'm a Sustainable Finance Officer at the French Ministry for the Ecological Transition. I will just give you some context elements on where this report and this works fits in, which is the recent evolution of the non-financial reporting requirements at the French and European level. As I guess some of you know, in France since 2015 we have the famous Article 173, which is about regulatory requirements for some investors, insurance companies, asset managers, and some specific institutions for occupational retirement provisions on non-financial reporting, which came from the Energy Transition for Green Growth Act, the same year, and on which there are specific requirements on climate-related risk, notably, and alignment with the Paris Agreement, even though there is no explicit mention of long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, but the exact wording is a contribution of investors to long-term ecological and energy transition goals, and as the only official long-term ecological goals so far is the Paris Agreement. In next year, I hope there will also have another for biodiversity with a COP15 of the convention on biodiversity, which will be held in China next year. But so far, this is only occurring for the Paris Agreement. So, in conjunction with the recent legal developments, there have been at the French level some evolutions within the French energy and climate law last year in 2019. Some extension, notably on the financial participants. Now the credit institutions and investment companies will be covered by these requirements on non-financial reporting. And starting next year, there will also be some specific requirements on the integration of biodiversity risk into investment strategies, but I will not go into further detail on this. And with the Ministry of Economy and Finance, we will publish a new implementation decree of this article by the end of the year 2020. And besides, as some of you know, there is this new European regulation on disclosure for investors, which has been adopted in late 2019 and will enter into force next year in March. As for the French requirements, there will also have some level 2 texts, which are the regulatory technical standards, to be published also by the end of this year. And we will try at best to harmonize these requirements between the European and the French level. So in the context of this new European regulation, we had, of course, in France to question the added value of the French rules, and basically we want to deepen elements on what are the specific ESG elements of the French rules, whereas on the European regulation there are multiple aspects, but with no specific elements on any ESG criteria. So in France, we have this criteria for climate-related risk and biodiversity risk soon, and alignment with the long-term ecological goals. So we really want to deepen these elements. At this stage, we don't know yet if we want to be more stringent or more precise on the methodological aspects related to these issues. So to be more clear, if we want to add some precision on the ingredients of the cookbook to take again the elements of the present to be presented today, or if you want to limitate the possibilities for stakeholders to use some type of methodologies. For example, we have seen I can say some limits in the fact that there is no precision on the methodological issues related to these elements. For example, some stakeholders are publishing a carbon footprint of their portfolios on one year to another, and with a static analysis, and they estimate this is an analysis of a climate transition risk or even alignment with the Paris Agreement, which is not really the case, considering the elements you need to gather to have an alignment with the Paris Agreement, the time horizon, notably. But so the first objective for us is to limit greenwashing, as you as you can guess. So this is why we really wanted to support the work done by ILB and I4C, and we are really glad of the result of this report, because it will help us very much to build our reflection on the evolution of the non-financial reporting requirements. So yeah, I can just say thank you for the work that has been done, and that we are really proud of the results, and to have supported this report. Thank you, Peter.
Sorry,
yeah,
I was on mute. Thank you, Clément. Let us move to the presentation by Alice now. Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. I hope you can hear me well. So indeed, I4C, the Institute for Climate Economics, has been associated to this work after the release of a discussion paper in 2019, presenting a framework for financial institutions to align with the Paris Agreement. So before we start the in-depth presentation of temperature alignment approaches, I will provide just a few introductory remarks highlighting the context in which these approaches can be used. So the concept of alignment emerged in response to the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015 and really reframed climate action from a focus on the near-term incremental increase of adaptation and mitigation actions, to really emphasize on the need for a deep and long-term transformation of economies and societies around three objectives. So first, the objective of decarbonizing economies. Second, the objective of adapting economies. And third, the objective of redirecting finance flows. And in addition, this agreement relies on a bottom-up and dynamic approach, which means that the pathway towards achieving these three objectives is to be defined by country-led national pathways to simultaneously achieve both climate, but also broader sustainable development objectives. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, financial institutions and other economic actors have taken commitments to align with the Paris Agreement. However, until very recently, there was no definition of what this commitment really means. And this is the reason why I4C last year issued this discussion paper, in which we really present that this commitment to be Paris aligned is a commitment that needs to be understood as a commitment to align all activities of one institution with the three goals and the associated bottom-up process agreed to by national governments in 2015. Yeah, thank you. So, but what does it mean really in practice? So I4C discussion paper proposed a framework that specifies three dimensions that all Paris alignment approaches should take into account. First, economic actors and financial institutions that would like to be Paris aligned should adopt a comprehensive scope of action and really seek to directly or indirectly support low GHG climate resilient development across all of their business areas, and really aim to take into account the impacts on broader systems and value chains. Second, they should prioritize actions that are consistent with both near-term climate objectives and long-term goals, and do not lead to lock-in or to maladaptation. And third, they should seek to best contribute to the goals of the agreement. Of course, the scale of contribution of financial institutions will vary from one institution to another, as institutions may be involved in different types of business lines that have impact-oriented objectives or more commercial objectives. However, a commitment to Paris alignment is a commitment to adapt the high level of ambition that is embodied in the Paris Agreement. So, what does it mean in practice? It means that institutions should first halt support for non-consistent activities to ensure that all of their activities are consistent with long-term goals. And second, they should determine but also act on how they can best leverage their potential to support low GHG climate resilient transformations in their countries and sectors of operations. and they should seek whenever possible to contribute to both incremental but also, and as much as possible, to the transformative changes to achieve all three objectives of the agreement, the objectives of decarbonizing economies, adapting economies, and redirecting finance flows. So doing this in practice, if we can go to the next slide, please. So doing this in practice will require financial institutions to integrate these considerations into their strategies and operational frameworks and procedures for decision-making and investments. Paris alignment approaches does require a combination of different procedures, tools, and instruments. And among the different methodologies that were developed over the past few years, portfolio temperature alignment methodologies have gained a lot of interest from practitioners, but also regulators, as mentioned by Clément. So these methodologies were developed to assess the compatibility or consistency of an asset or portfolio with a given trajectory limiting temperature rise under a specific level. This measure should above all make it possible to reflect on what a 2-degree compatible economy and finance should look like. To date, these methodologies only focus on one of the three objectives of the agreement, the objective of decarbonizing economies, but very often with a top-down approach and not the bottom-up and country-led approach that is promoted in the agreement. None of them can guarantee that an entire portfolio really do no harm, nor do they really assess the level of contribution of this same portfolio. However, in combination with other tools, other instruments, and other measures, these assessment approaches may be very useful as they can provide financial institutions a forward-looking and portfolio-wide outlook. So without further ado, I will now let the floor to Julie for the in-depth presentation of these methodologies.
Thank you very much, Alice. Julie, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Clément. Thank you to everyone for being here. So I'm Julie Reynaud. I'm a member of the Institut Louis Bachelier network, and I'm very happy to be presenting the alignment cookbook today. So why did we write this report? As already mentioned earlier, we've seen in the past few years an increase in the methodologies that seek to measure the alignment of a company or a portfolio with the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement or with temperature trajectories. But we also have noticed the lack of transparency often in the disclosure of those methods and results. So the objective of this report was really to increase transparency around these and educate the market as to the recipe of those methodology, what goes in, to help the market assess, whether it is fit for purpose or not. So who is the main audience? As some of you may have noticed, the report is 180 pages. So I don't expect anyone to read the full report from A to Z. The report was written in such a way that you can look for answers to the specific questions you're asking yourselves in the report. So it's meant to be a resource rather than a report that you read from start to finish. The first part is targeted at decision makers that wish to understand a bit those methods and the methodologies and the specific methodologies. The second part is much more technical, goes into specific details and look at the different choices that can be made at different steps of the methodologies and try to speak practitioner to practitioner, about what are the different choices that can be made, the data sources, and what is possible, what is not possible with the current state of knowledge, and what are the implications on the result. So on the next slide, as I foresee already mentioned, in this specific report, we define temperature alignment methodologies as a mathematical measure of the proximity between the climate performance of a portfolio. And you could express the climate performance of the portfolio through a carbon footprint, a green-brown share metric, a score, or any other metric. And on the other hand, one or several temperature benchmarks, which are themselves taken from specific scenarios and of course over a defined time period. So as most of you know, a multitude of metrics are available today to investors that wish to measure the climate performance of their portfolio. And carbon footprinting and to a certain extent the green share of portfolios are the most widely used today. But the problem with those metrics, as often discussed, is that they cannot be used to make a dynamic and a qualified assessment of the sufficiency or insufficiency of the climate performance of the portfolio with regards to the long-term global temperature limitation objective. So, for example, let's take a portfolio which is invested, 20% in so-called green companies. Is it enough? Is it sufficient? Let's consider the portfolio that has a lower carbon footprint than its benchmark. Again, is it enough, compared to the long-term global temperature objective? What is considered enough in the context of climate goals? So these types of methodologies, the temperature alignment assessment methodologies, have been developed to assess the compatibility, and this is a key word, of portfolios with the temperature rise limitation goal in order to indicate, and to capture prospectively what too much carbon emissions or not enough green activities mean at the level of a company or a portfolio. So in this family, we can note, for example, at company level, the approach of the Transition Pathway Initiative or the methods put forward by the Science Based Targets Initiative to help companies set targets. And at investor level, in this report, we have counted so far 11 data providers offering such methods to the market. And of course, many investors have been working very hard on the topic and developing their own in-house approaches too. So now that we have better defined what we mean exactly in this report by temperature alignment methodologies, let's explore what these methods can be used for. So on the next slide, please. So the first key message is that temperature alignment assessments are not an end and they're not sufficient in themselves. So as presented by Alice from I4CE, aligning the activities of a financial institution to the Paris Agreement is a much wider process that needs to happen at both the strategic and the operational levels. And so temperature alignment assessment methods are one piece of the puzzle that can support alignment strategies of investors. And many investors have been working on the topic through a number of organizations and coalitions that tackle different parts of the wider alignment process, whether it is target setting, for example, with the Science Based Targets Initiative for financial institutions, alignment strategy with the CA100+, or methodologies with, for example, the work of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the TCFD, the IIGCC, and others. As mentioned earlier, the focus of this report is not on alignment strategies. It is really on the assessment methods. And these approaches can be seen as one of the multiple tools that are available to investors today to set up and to monitor the results of an alignment strategy, amongst, of course, as mentioned by Alice, a number of other approaches and indicators that already exist. So now that we have situated where this type of approaches fit and can be useful in the wider financial sector alignment process, let's get a bit more technical and discuss the recipe and ingredients of these types of methods. So on this slide, you can see the results of discussions we had with many experts, and I really want to thank everyone that helped us in the process. And it's, of course, also based on a literature and methodological review. And we noticed that most temperature alignment methodologies available today, they each comprise of 4 general steps which are all more or less the same. Of course, within those methodological steps, as we will see later, there are many other choices that can be made. But for now, let's focus on these 4 overarching steps. So the first one is, of course, to measure the climate performance of the portfolio or the company that we wish to analyze. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, the climate performance can be measured through a wide variety of metrics: green-brown share, technology metric, carbon metrics, scores, you name it. The second step is to choose one or several decarbonization scenarios. For example, the IEA or the IPCCs are the most widely used, but there are many others that are available. The third step is to convert the decarbonization trajectories that you get from those scenarios to temperature alignment benchmarks that apply specifically to the micro actors, so the companies or investment portfolios that we are analyzing. And then the fourth step, of course, is to put the results of step 1 and step 3 together to perform the temperature alignment assessment and compare the two and look at the proximity between the two. And the results of the step 4 can be expressed through a wide number of indicators, but one of the indicators that has been gaining traction recently is the temperature or the implied temperature rise metric that we will discuss a bit later in more details. So the results of this type of assessment, they are performed usually at company level, and then they are aggregated at portfolio level, either before or after the alignment assessment is performed. So this, we've really observed both approaches in the literature. And finally, adjustments to the results can be made, for example, to reflect the relative importance of different sectors in the low carbon transition. So in many instances, the distinction is made between temperature alignment methods that rely on technology metrics and others that rely on carbon metrics. We find this distinction, for example, in the TEG Climate Benchmark Report. But as you can see on this specific slide, there are many more differences than just the alignment metric chosen to express, the alignment and the decarbonization pathway. The devil is in the details. So, for example, how do you define portfolio climate performance? What perimeter should be used? How do you choose the scenario and the reference trajectories? Should you measure the gap, between the climate performance of the portfolio and the decarbonization trajectory at a specific point in time, let's say 2025, 2030, or should you measure it through time, cumulatively? How should you express the results? So on this slide, you can see a few of the specific methodological choices that can be made within each of the 4 steps I described earlier, and you can see that there are really many methodological choices, and these are discussed and their implications in much detail in the report. So on the next slide, many permutations of the same recipe are possible. And in practice, it is possible to imagine as many temperature alignment methodologies as the number of possible permutations between each of the methodological choices that are available and applicable, as described on the last slide. And what you see on this slide is a sample of the specific temperature assessment questions that the methods we reviewed help answer. And what starts to become clear is that even if we classify all those methods into the same bucket, into the same family, the range of the possible methodological choices that are possible in practice lead all of these assessments to answer very different questions. And it is essential for data providers and methodology users to be aware of the specific assessment questions being answered by each of the methods and be transparent about that. In the report, you will find a detailed appendix about the 11 different methods available today publicly and the specific assessment question they answer. So if this is a topic that interests you, I invite you to consult this part of the report. And of course, we will see a bit later how these different assessment questions impact the results on a given portfolio or index. So on the next slide, please. This yields the question, is there a recipe which is more relevant than another? Or is there a question that is more relevant than another? And I will take the risk to disappoint you on this million-dollar question. Today, there is no ideal temperature alignment methodology. What we say is that it is up to the users to choose the methodologies that best fit their information needs, and it is up to the regulators to become more precise as to what should be the minimum technical requirements that methodology should meet in order to be considered fit for purpose. Because currently, there is a lack of clear and common definition. What alignment with a temperature trajectory means or implies for investors and investment portfolios remain unclear, beyond, of course, the general definition I highlighted at the beginning of my presentation. Not only the characteristics that an alignment methodology should have are not well defined, nor the reference point. And as you may know, there are a number of coalitions and organizations that are working on this topic at the moment. I already mentioned the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the TCFD, the Institutional Investor Group in Climate Change, there's the Science Based Targets Initiative for Financial Institutions. And we should also mention, and it's already been mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, that I4CE and the Institut Louis Bachelier will publish a second report in the autumn that will examine the feasibility of introducing minimum requirements for the use of such metrics for reporting on climate risks and alignment. So it will be much wider than alignment. It will look at alignment, but it will also look at transition risk and physical risk. So in the alignment cookbook, we still start exploring some of the characteristics that we believe to be key for this type of assessment, especially if this type of assessment seeks to measure the alignment in relation to the temperature objective of the Paris Agreement. But in practice, it is essential to be aware and to consider the range of trade-offs that data providers face, mainly because of data availability. And one key message is that often what is best from a theoretical perspective today may not be easily applicable in practice. So let's focus the remainder of this webinar on some of these trade-offs. So the first trade-off on the next slide is the famous and infamous Scope 3. So as most of you know, emissions within the value chain, or Scope 3 emissions, represent the largest share of companies' total emission for a large number of sectors. And making investment decisions based on methodologies that rely only on Scope 1 and 2 emissions may in fact lead to an increase of total emissions by displacing emissions along the value chain. And for this reason, in our view, it is recommended that for the sectors where it is the most relevant, temperature alignment assessments incorporate value chain emissions, take into account those value chain emissions. And this is, of course, the case for sectors such as the oil and gas and automobile manufacturer sectors, but it is also the case for food and beverages, banks, and other sectors. The problem, and many of you will tell me this, is of course that data availability and data quality, although it's been increasing, historically it's been very low. And in the context of temperature alignment assessment, there is another difficulty, which is the fact that sector and scope-specific decarbonization benchmarks are not available for every sector or every Scope 3 categories. So in our review of the current methodologies that are being offered in the market, we have noticed a range of strategies adopted in the face of these trade-offs. So some data providers still include Scope 3, but have to make a range of additional hypotheses and calculations in doing so, whether it is estimating the Scope 3 emissions of companies when they do not report on this, whether it is building additional decarbonization trajectories for specific Scope 3 sectors, etc., etc. Other data providers have chosen to exclude those sectors for which data is not readily available, and wait, of course, for data to be available. There's a lot of work going on, for example, the financial sector, on the financial sector, on the food and bev sector, etc., etc. And then finally, other providers include the Scope 3, but decide to apply a decarbonization benchmark which is sector agnostic. So to be considered a line, a company has to decrease its total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by the same rate that the overall economy should decarbonize according to a specific scenario to be on a 2-degree track. So on the next slide, sorry, Peter, on the next slide, if possible. Thank you.
Yes, I switched to the next slide. Don't you see it?
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, it's me.
Okay.
Apologies for that. Thank you. So this is the second trade-off, which relates to the time horizon. So there is, of course, a disconnect between the time horizon embedded within climate models, international climate treaties, national climate plans, investment horizons for different asset classes, and the reporting of forward-looking data by businesses. And as we mentioned earlier, temporality is a central point in the concept of alignment, is one of its raison d'être. A portfolio can be aligned with a 2-degree trajectory when a short-term perspective is adopted, but it may not be in the long term. But again, the problem is that the few companies report on forward-looking data, and when they do, it's seldom on a consistent or comparable basis. And in addition, the further the time horizon, the more uncertain the estimation of the future climate performance of a company or a portfolio. So in the report, we have identified several types of forward-looking data. These include company-level decarbonization targets, revealed plans, CapEx, extrapolations, and each has pros and cons and different availability levels, and answer different types of questions, and all of these is discussed in great details in the report. In a nutshell, when we look at the strategy of data providers, in estimating future emissions or future climate performance of companies and portfolios, we notice a few practices. So the first one is that a number of providers decide not to use any forward-looking data, and therefore compare the current company or portfolio climate performance with what this performance should be, let's say in 2030 or 2035, in a 2-degree scenario. So it really assesses the gap between the current situation and what it should be in the future to be considered 2-degree aligned. Other data providers have chosen to rely on decarbonization targets, and they take these targets at their face value. And so these methodologies, they answer the question, what is the implied decarbonization rate and the implied temperature, which is embedded into companies' self-declared targets, and are these sufficient to put us on a 2-degree trajectory? Other data providers use extrapolation and answer the question, if the company or portfolio continues on the same path as in the past, where are we headed? And then finally, there are a number of providers that use a combination of these approaches in an attempt to forecast what the future climate performance of a company may be. So they use targets, extrapolation, asset level data, etc., to triangulate each of the different data sets and try to arrive to a better estimate. And of course, this answers yet another question. So I will let Peter now complement what I've been saying by highlighting some of the key research questions this yields for academics.
Thank you, Julie. So yes, although the report primarily targets the investors and the decision makers, it was also our hope that by bringing transparency and clear definitions into this field, that we will foster academic research. And to this end, we try to summarize the key uncertainties and the related interest in relevant economic research questions that could be of interest for the academia. These uncertainties and research questions are also described in detail in an accompanying paper, which is called Portfolio Alignment, Science or Art, and it is now available from SSRM. So I will summarize these uncertainties and research questions relevant for each step, each of the 4 steps of the portfolio alignment recipe as presented by Julie. So in step 1 relates to assessing the climate performance of the portfolio. And here there are, of course, a multitude of deep uncertainties. One of the first one being the uncertainty related to data availability, both to insufficient coverage or of different sectors, for example, and to data quality, for example, the availability of scope 3 emissions data that Julie mentioned. Then there is the uncertainty that is related to the distribution of scope 3 as well as avoided and removed emissions along the value chain of a company. Then there is uncertainty related to ownership boundaries. So in order to count the emissions, you need to understand what belongs to whom, and it is not always very clear. Finally, there are the various types of scenario-related uncertainty that we will discuss in more detail a bit later. And of course, the uncertainty that is related to projections of future climate performance, how to estimate the future performance of future climate performance of a company. And the economic research questions are, for example, what would be the best way to measure transitions of economies? What is a good climate performance metric? How to distribute scope 3 emissions along the value chain while avoiding double counting of emissions. This is a very non-trivial question as well. And finally, for the last uncertainty, the question would be how to forecast investment decisions of economic agents. So how to predict what the investment decisions of a given company in a given sector will be in 10 years from now. And this, there is economic literature that tries to forecast this type of decisions based on game theory and various interactions between the agents. Now I leave the floor back to Julie for the next slide.
Thank you, Peter. So now we go on reviewing some of the trade-offs that relate to the second step, which is choosing one or several transition scenarios. So as you know, a multitude of decarbonization trajectories lead to the same temperature outcome. There are several ways of reaching a 2-degree or well below 2-degree temperature outcome. And a scenario is a plausible representation of an uncertain future and a story on how to reach it. So the associated trajectories that come from these scenarios, they depend on the wide range of parameters and hypotheses that are embedded within those scenarios. So as a consequence, if we take, for example, 2 1.5-degree trajectory from 2 different scenarios, well, they will have differences in terms of how the remaining carbon budget is being allocated between time, between sectors, and therefore the shape of the decarbonization curve will be different. So the choice of one or several scenarios and the associated trajectories, it depends on a range of conceptual and practical considerations. If we take a precautionary approach, this would dictate that we use scenarios that peak sooner rather than later, that are more ambitious in terms of decarbonization, or that rely as little as possible on carbon removals, for example. But the problem is that in practice, scenario users and so methodology developers are often limited by practical considerations. Indeed, the trajectories that comes out of those scenarios, they are expressed at different levels of temporal, of geographical, of sectoral granularity. And so in practice, what we observed is that most data providers and investors use the scenarios that have the most relevant data granularity for the perimeter they chose, rather than the scenario that would conceptually be better suited to their assessment question. Another point to note is that third-party derived scenarios, they were not developed to support portfolio temperature alignment methods. So it's completely normal that the scope or the focus or the outputs are not perfectly suited to be used directly as inputs in these types of methodologies and assessments. And so in light of this challenge, data providers and investors have used in practice a range of strategies to adjust or to derive to degree or other trajectories that are more suited to their methods and to their needs. The issue is that adjusting and combining third-party derived trajectories can raise consistency questions. For example, scenarios and trajectories may lead to the same temperature outcome, as I mentioned, but they will have different certainty levels and different assumptions built in, for example, in terms of the GDP forecast. And this is important because in a scenario, all the variables are linked. So if you use a trajectory from scenario A for one sector and another trajectory from scenario B for another sector to derive the 2-degree benchmark, it may not be directly comparable and the aggregation of the results may not be consistent. So what we note in the report is that it is essential to discuss at least and to ensure the consistency of the trajectories when different scenarios are being used and combined together. And more research is needed in this area. So on the next slide.
Yes, I think it's my turn now to make a zoom on scenario uncertainty from the scientific point of view. So it is, as you probably know very well, the climate projections and the global warming scenarios that are used in particular for portfolio alignment are subject to multiple sources of uncertainty. So we do not know that a given carbon budget brings us to a given temperature. There is uncertainty in this temperature. And there are several layers of this uncertainty. The dominant uncertainty in the short term, like up to 10 years, is simply the intrinsic variability of the climate system. Climate is inherently random. The wind does not blow at the same speed today as it will this year. Even the average wind speed for this year will not be necessarily the same as the average wind speed or the average temperature for the next year because of climate variability, which is related to, for example, memory of the ocean system and so on. The second uncertainty is related to the uncertainty of future emissions, of future forcings in the climatologist language of the climate system by the nature and anthropogenic forcing agents. So forcing agents are typically emissions of greenhouse gases or aerosols. And even if in the scenarios that are used for portfolio alignment, the CO2 component is fixed, there are other forcing agents which create this additional uncertainty. So the scenarios will still be subject to uncertainty coming from this source. The third source of uncertainty is related to future availability of technologies which are required to implement the scenarios. For example, how widely will the carbon capture and storage technology be available in 30 years' time? And finally, the last sort of uncertainty is the model uncertainty. That is the uncertainty with which we can predict the effect of the forcing agents on the climate systems, because these scenarios are produced by models and models are imperfect. Some models take into account some phenomena but not others. So the way to estimate, to evaluate this uncertainty is of course to take different models, and that is why there are the model intercomparison projects that are carried out regularly by IPCC. Now these graphs illustrate this uncertainty in the scenarios to get an idea of the order of magnitude. For example, if you look at the left graph, so both graphs come from IPCC reports. If you look at the left graph, so the left graph illustrates the first, the second, and the fourth sources of uncertainty. So this does not illustrate the technological uncertainty, but here we have the orange is the internal variability, so about half a degree in temperature. The blue is the spread between the models. So this is the model uncertainty. And you see that by 2100, by the year 2100, the model uncertainty is about 1.5 degrees. So actually, with the same carbon emissions, one model may predict 2 degrees warming, and the other one may predict, the other extreme may predict 3.5 degrees. And finally, the green area is the spread between different RCP scenarios, so between different emission scenarios. So the lowest one corresponds to the lowest emissions, and the highest one corresponds to business as usual, highest emissions. And the right graph illustrates more or less the same thing. So also the spread between the models and the spread between the RCP scenarios. So here we have 4 RCP scenarios, 4 in different emission scenarios. The smallest emissions is 2.6, and the highest is 8.5. And for each color, we have the average, the model average in the dark colored curve, and the light colored area represents all the available models. So this graph in particular shows that for higher emissions levels, the uncertainty is much larger for higher temperatures than for lower temperatures, because we do not know at the 6 degrees warming, we do not know how the climate system will react. There might be some phenomena that we are simply not able to predict with the models that we have now, like tipping points and things like that. Now, so this uncertainty in climate scenarios leads, of course, to an associated uncertainty in the remaining carbon budget, enabling us to limit the global warming below a given level, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And this table at the bottom of the slide illustrates this uncertainty in the carbon budget. For example, the first 3 cells give you the 33rd percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 66th percentile of the remaining carbon budget in gigatons of CO2 to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And you see that the uncertainty is really very wide. So uncertainty, as I said, is higher for higher temperatures, since our knowledge of the behavior of climate systems in these regions is scarce. So if you hear that the portfolio temperature is aligned to 6 degrees, the underlying uncertainty is larger than if the portfolio is aligned to 2 degrees. Also, according to IPCC, the absolute temperature characteristics of different pathways are more difficult to distinguish than relative features, meaning that it is easier to say that to compare 2 portfolios, which one is aligned to a lower temperature, rather than give a precise temperature corresponding to a given portfolio. And of course, if you want to hedge against this uncertainty, then you should take scenarios which impose deeper emission reductions in the near term, because they are less subject to both model uncertainty, to the uncertainty of the future climate response, and also to the uncertainty related to future availability of technologies. Because typically scenarios which allow stronger emissions in the near term, they require carbon removal technologies that do not exist now to be available in order to cut the emissions at a later date at a fast rate. Right. And so in step 2, what are the main uncertainties? So of course the scenario uncertainty that I discussed, and also the uncertainty that is related to sectoral distribution of global benchmarks. So if once you have, for example, if you use an IPCC scenario, the sector granularity will be quite low. So how to distribute this scenario among different sectors, also among different regions. This is a difficult questions, and also an interesting research questions that several people try to address. So how to distribute global emissions to specific sectors and regions to take into account economic dynamics and interactions both among economic agents and also among countries. Typically, the scenario distribution comes out of international negotiations. So these international negotiations can also be modeled using game theory to understand the outcome and the resulting distribution of emissions among regions. And the second research question that we identified is how to quantify the technological uncertainty. and the effect of the technological uncertainty on the final assessment result. Because this technological uncertainty is not really well discussed and analyzed in the sources like IPCC reports. Now I give the floor back to Julie to go on.
Thank you very much. So now if we look at step 3, so step 2 was to choose the scenario or scenarios. Out of the scenarios, we need to take the decarbonization trajectories and then apply those and make them specific to the micro actor we are analyzing, whether it is a company or a portfolio. So basically, we have a remaining carbon budget. This is a global cake. This global cake first should be distributed across time, geographies, and sectors, as Peter mentioned. And then it needs to be further distributed between sectors and companies, between companies and actors or investment portfolios, for example. So here again, methodological developers face a range of trade-offs in doing this translation to micro actors. There are different ways of doing this translation. The first way is to apply reduction rates to all companies within a given portfolio, sector, or geography. So the idea is to say, if under the chosen scenario, emissions need to decrease by 3% per year in absolute terms in order to limit temperature rise under 2 degrees, then all the companies in my portfolio should decrease their absolute emissions by 3%, regardless of their starting climate performance of their sector, etc., to be considered 2 degree aligned. The second way of distributing the trajectories to specific actors is to say that all companies within a given sector must reduce their emission intensities to a common value. It must converge to a common value. This common value being dictated by the temperature pathways taken from the chosen scenario in step 2 once again. So, if you use the first approach, the approach that applies the same decarbonization rate to all companies, the issue is that it does not take into account the starting climate performance of the company. So a company which is very carbon intensive will have to decarbonize as fast and as much as a company that is already low carbon and has done already many efforts to be considered 2 degree aligned. So you can see how this approach may not be considered very fair, especially by the low carbon company. The issue is that this approach is the only one which is applicable to companies in sectors where no specific decarbonization pathway is available. And so if you wish to cover a high number of companies and sectors in your portfolio, you may need to use this type of approach. The second approach that says that companies must converge towards the same level at a given point in time, it's good because it takes into account the climate performance of the company. However, it is only applicable to sectors where a specific decarbonization pathway exists, because you could not be expecting, for example, an oil and gas company and a media company to be converging to the same emission intensity. This wouldn't work, so it has to be a sectoral-based approach. And second, it needs to be expressed in intensity, because once again, you cannot assume that 2 companies, one large and one small, will converge to the same absolute emission. This is impossible, so you need to express the benchmark in an intensity term. The issue is that when you use an intensity-based benchmark, whether the normalization metric is unit of production or revenue, it does not necessarily guarantee that the overall remaining carbon budget is respected. Because, for example, if the production or the revenue growth rate is higher in reality than the one that was embedded within the scenario used, the company or the sector may be considered 2 degree aligned based on the intensity metric. But in practice, the overall remaining carbon budget will be overshot and we will not be on track for a 2 degree world. So here again, there is a trade-off between coverage, method availability, and taking into account sector and company specificities. So on the next slide.
Yes. What are the key uncertainties related to this third step? So of course, there is the uncertainty, still the scenario uncertainty, but more related to macroeconomic scenarios needed to compute basically the denominator in intensity-based benchmark, for example, evolution of GDP. there is the uncertainty related to the time horizon for computing these measures. And when it comes to distribution of sectoral benchmarks to micro-level actors, as Julie mentioned, this can be done in different ways. So this also introduces a level of uncertainty. And this also leads to interesting economic research questions, because the approaches that are currently used, well, they make sense, but they are prescriptive, and they rarely take into account the actual economic costs and feasibility of decarbonizing different companies. So research is needed in order to explore the possibilities of setting these micro-level benchmark in a somewhat optimal way that would allow, for example, to reach a low-carbon future at a lower cost.
Now, so the results of the temperature alignment assessment. So on the one hand, you take the climate performance of the company, current and future. On the other, you take the specific decarbonization benchmark that is taken from the scenario you chose. And then you put it together to measure the proximity between the two and produce an alignment metric. There are different types of alignment metric, but one that has been gaining traction, as I mentioned, is the temperature metric. And on the graph on this slide, you can see how it is calculated. I will not enter into the details, but this is quite well detailed in the report. A larger, let's say, number of investors use this metric for exploratory purposes. But recently we've heard that, you know, it may be a metric that is easier to communicate to a wider range of stakeholders. Because to say, for example, that a portfolio is 2-degree aligned creates a graphic system of equivalency with the international temperature rise limitation objective. But the question is, and that we try to ask in the report is the temperature metric really a useful one in the current state of knowledge? Well, first, as Peter has been, you know, explaining throughout the presentation, it is important to note the multiple layers of uncertainties, and each of those layers of uncertainties at each step, they compound themselves. I like to compare these methods to lasagna, you know. So this calls into question the desirability of translating the results of such assessments into a single metric that may give a false sense of certainty to the uninformed reader. Second, it's important to note that temperature alignment approaches and methodologies, they are quite simplistic in comparison to the IPCC climate models and approaches. So it can be quite misleading for this reason to say, for example, that a portfolio is 2-degree aligned. Third, it's debatable whether the temperature metric is actionable. If you think about it, before having the temperature metric, you have an intermediary metric, which is, for example, the percentage of decarbonization of a portfolio, or which is the quantity of emissions above or below the benchmark over the period studied. And this may be more actionable than a temperature metric, because these metrics highlight the extent to which emissions need to be reduced or the green activities expanded to be 2-degree aligned. And then finally, the results across the methods, they are not necessarily comparable today, once again. Again, because of the lack of common definition and standard in the face of the methodological trade-offs and uncertainties that we have been describing throughout this presentation. And we will explore this in more details now. So on the next slide.
Yes, on the next slide, what are the specific sources of uncertainty relevant to the computation of this portfolio alignment measure, in addition to all those that we have discussed so far? Well, there is, of course, still the time horizon uncertainty for dynamic methods. For the specific case of implied temperature rise metric, there is the uncertainty related to non-linearity of the climate response. So often these metrics are computed by linearizing. So for example, you have one scenario, you have the overshoot, and then you interpolate, you compute the temperature by multiplying the overshoot by a given number. And this is probably not the best approach, especially for large temperatures, because as we know, the climate response is nonlinear. And there is also the uncertainty that is related to different ways to aggregate these metrics at portfolio level. So this brings me to the research questions that are relevant at this stage. So one research question is how to aggregate the metrics if you know the temperature of each stock in the portfolio, how to compute the temperature at the level of the portfolio, taking into account that this measure is nonlinear. And also from the point of view of uncertainty quantification, how can you quantify the, how can you aggregate the different sources of uncertainty appearing at different steps of computing the implied temperature rise metric in order to produce an uncertainty measure for the final result. Of course, it is much, in a sense, more natural to, rather than provide a single temperature value, to do as several providers do, to provide a range of temperatures, but how to obtain this range, how to quantify the uncertainty related to this final measure. And in addition to these questions that I mentioned, there are also a few, we have identified a few cross-cutting research questions that cannot be related to a single step of the alignment procedure, but still are very important for the whole exercise. One important key question is the measure of additionality of investor action. So when, if your portfolio is aligned, actually, if you do make some steps in order to make your portfolio aligned, does it really create an impact? Does it really lead to emission reductions? This, of course, is a very important question that can probably be addressed using some economic modeling to compare what happens in different scenarios. Next question is, to what extent are such methodologies useful as proxies to measure transition risks? As we saw in the beginning, sometimes these methods are presented as measures of transition risks. This is not really the case because this is not the question that they answer, but to what extent can we still recover some information about transition risk from this type of alignment assessment? And finally, the last cross-cutting question relates to the alignment with the Paris Agreement. So as we saw, the assessment of portfolio alignment to a temperature scenario is not really the same as assessing the alignment to the Paris Agreement. What else is needed to evaluate the alignment to the Paris Agreement to the fullest extent? This is also, in our view, an important cross-cutting research question relevant to this exercise. Now, I give the floor to you for the test.
So after the theory, the practice, and we will take the last 5 minutes of our presentation to show you the results of the practical test we did. So we decided to test the 11 different methodologies that are available and that I mentioned on similar indices to compare the results and see if they, what are the differences in the results. And we chose 2 indices, the Euronext Low Carbon 100 and the SBF 120 indices to do this test. We chose the Low Carbon 100 in particular because of the combination of the multiple low carbon strategies that are embedded in the construction of the Euronext Low Carbon 100. For example, there is a pocket of green companies or companies that derive more than 50% of their revenue from green products or services. There is a fossil fuel exclusion, and then there is a use of data and score to include best-in-class Scope 1, 2, 3, and avoided emission companies. And where possible, we calculated the results for those 2 indices for 2 years, 2018 and 2019. So on the next slide, you can see the high-level results of the analysis. And this slide is very difficult to read, and this is on purpose. It was to show that it is really difficult to compare the results of each method directly. Indeed, each method has different perimeters, assumptions, and indicators. Data coverage is highly variable from one method to another. And more particularly, each method, expresses the results through a range of indicators, so the temperature metric, but not only. So on the next graph, what you can see is the relative dispersion of the portfolio of the index temperature relative to the 2-degree benchmark. So the 2-degree benchmark is the blue line. So the green spot is the low carbon 100, and the blue spot is the SBF 120. And you can see that the results are highly variable from one slide to another. And then finally, on the next slide, so we've done a wealth of analysis on the data in the report, and you can find lots of different things in the report. And here I'm just focusing on some of the key results. And on this slide, what you can see is the results of a linear correlation analysis that we've done between the data sets that we had at hand of these methods. So of course, it's really important to note that the sample size is quite small in most cases. So this is just, one example of the type of analysis that we could be doing, but I strongly encourage more analysis to be done, on this specific topic. And what we can see is that there is little or even negative correlation between most of the methods we analyzed, but still, some of the methods are quite well correlated between each other. And we find that the methods that are best correlated with each other are the methods that share the same methodological features. Methods that incorporate Scope 3 emissions, for example, or that try to incorporate the positive aspect of the story, or the contribution of companies, the positive contribution of companies to the energy and ecological transition. These methods, they tend to have a higher linear correlation coefficient between themselves. Similarly, methods that only rely on Scope 1 and 2 tend to be better correlated between each other. And we also find that methods that are point in time, that is, that look at the proximity between the climate performance of a portfolio and the temperature benchmark at a specific point in time, 2025 or 2030 or 2035, they tend to be better correlated between each other than the methods that look at the alignment over a period of time and that calculate the alignment results cumulatively through the different years. So this first analysis, although it needs to be taken with great care for the reasons I mentioned, points that, all the methodological trade-offs and strategies that data providers have put in place to manage these trade-offs, in the context of low data availability, well, this is not only in theory, it actually has, an impact on the results and on the actual final results on different indices. So I will stop here the presentation. On the next slide, you have some of the key messages we've tried to emphasize throughout the presentation. Without further ado, I will leave the floor to questions, if you have any.
Yes, thank you very much, Julie. Please feel free to ask questions. You can either type them in the chat box or raise your hand, and Christelle will let you speak and ask your question.
All right, no question today.
No questions yet. There is one, I think, in the Q&A box, or two questions. We have seen.
You want me to?
Yeah, I can read the question and maybe you can answer about that.
Please do.
The first question is, we have seen the variability between different methodologies and scenario assessment. Are there any efforts to unify, agree on one methodology?
There are some efforts underway by industry coalition to try to make those methods converge. So the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance has issued a set of guiding principles, and they're still working on it at the moment to try to unify the principles being used by those methods. The Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change and the TCFD are also working on it. And of course, there is the initiative of the Science Based Targets Initiative for financial institutions. So this space is a very active space at the moment. And we can expect a number of reports and recommendations to be out, I think, by the end of next year.
Okay, so next question. Don't International Energy Agency scenarios already derived from IPCC scenarios, and the International Energy Agency scenarios are also partly used by other models? With the new set of IPCC models, there will be a cascading effect on most models. Do you have a map of all these relationships and already an idea of the consequences of the new IPCC models?
So it's a very good question. No, we haven't done the map of all these relationships. Just one point on the relationship between the IEA and the IPCC scenario. There are comparisons between the two. For example, the IEA publishes on their website, a comparison of their 2-degree and SDS and BDS trajectory in comparison to the IPCC scenarios. But the trajectory, so the time repartition used by the IEA is not derived from the IPCC. The starting point, the carbon budget may be the same, but the curve in itself is based on the proprietary method of the IEA, which distributes emission based on cost efficiency, amongst other things. So yes, there are cascading effects, but they are not one-to-one effect, or at least I would not expect. But I'm not aware of any work that has been doing this. I don't know, Peter, if you are aware of any on your side?
No, not really. I don't think so. And no, I just wanted to mention that there are also NGFS scenarios that were published a couple of weeks ago that provide an interesting alternative, and that I think might be used also for this kind of exercise. One feature of NGFS scenarios is that they also include some aspects of physical risks, which is not the case for International Energy Agency scenarios, for example. So, next question: can you please give a few examples of what you mean by micro actors?
Yes, so by micro actor, it's I just mean any companies. So, for example, okay, so let's say you've got the IEA scenario. The IEA scenario then has a decarbonization trajectory for different sectors and for different geographies. So, for example, it will have a decarbonization trajectory for the utilities that could be applied to the utilities sector or electricity generation. But then, should this curve be applied directly to an EDF or an NG or an NL, or should this curve be further adapted or distributed to those companies to take into account their specificity, including their, sector mapping, geographical exposure, and their current climate starting performance. And so this is what I mean by micro actors, and this is what I mean by, performing a third step, which is allocating the sector level decarbonization trajectories to specific micro actors or to specific companies.
Thank you. Next question. Given the high variability of results and the multiple layers of uncertainties from such top-down methods, should we not rather focus on making sure that the activity-specific thresholds of the EU taxonomy are based on sector activity-specific 2-degree scenarios? In short, don't you think that a dynamic version of green share is a better metric?
So there are two parts in the question. So the first question on the EU taxonomy. So the EU taxonomy refers to alignment, right? And refers to the concept of alignment in the paper. And the main difference between the taxonomy and a temperature alignment method is the fact that a temperature alignment method focuses on the trajectory. And so a company or an activity which is 100% aligned to the taxonomy will not be necessarily compatible with a 2-degree trajectory, at least on the short to medium run, because the temperature alignment methodologies, they rely on the assumption that, you know, a portfolio, for example, which is exposed to brown assets, if those brown assets, they decarbonize and they are phased out at the appropriate speed, then it can, in theory, be considered 2-degree. So there's really a difference between the two, and the taxonomy approach is very complementary, I think, to temperature alignment methods, or actually it's the other way around. Temperature alignment methods are very complementary to the taxonomy. For the second part of the question, don't you think that a dynamic version of the green share is a better metric? Actually, there are some temperature alignment methodologies that rely on a dynamic version of the green share. If you look at the PACTA 2 degrees investing methodology, for example, you know, this method assesses the alignment based on the trajectory and the speed at which companies increase their green share and decrease their brown share, and compare that to the speed at which they should be doing so in specific 2-degree scenarios. So some of the temperature alignment methods do rely on a dynamic version of the green share. Whether it's better or not, I mean, there are pros and cons to both approaches, and we discussed that in more details in the report, but to be honest, at the moment, I cannot say that one approach is better than the other.
So last question in the list. Could you please explain a little bit more the correlation table you just showed for the test results? How exactly should we read this table, orange and green colors? Which are the methodologies who seem to be closer and the ones who show very different results? So,
yes, so the orange and green is just to attempt to facilitate the reading. So the green is the higher correlation coefficient, but you can see that when I say higher, it's still quite low in certain instances. And the orange is the higher negative correlation coefficient. So again, this table needs to be taken with great care. It's just an exercise I did, and it really depends on the sample. But some of the things you can see is that, first of all, methodologies that I call associated methodologies, they are highly correlated between each other. It's normal that the results of an assessment by Arabesque in 2030 will be correlated with the results of Arabesque in 2050. So this is not a very interesting conclusion, it's just reassuring. However, you can see that some methods are quite well correlated with each other. For example, I'm thinking about the iCare and Consult, the Carbon 4, and the NEC metric, which exhibit higher than 0.5 correlation coefficient. And all those methods take into account Scope 3, and all those methods try to capture, in their own way, you know, the positive side of the story, as I mentioned earlier. So not only the decarbonization of brown assets, but also, you know, the increase in green activities. So this is quite an interesting one. After that, honestly, we would need to do a number of additional tests to try to explain why those methods are correlated with each other, or not. So I don't have the answer for most of those numbers, but I thought it would still be interesting to show them, to show, you know, what type of conclusions we could be making if we had better data and better data sets to perform such analysis.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie. So I don't think we have any more questions. And if this is indeed the case, it remains just to thank all the participants of the webinar and all the panelists, of course. And please feel free to consult the report, which is available for download on the website of Institut Louis Bachelier. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Enjoy. Thank you, everyone.
Christelle, tu peux arrêter l'enregistrement, je pense.